Hey guy, welcome back. Tonight we embark on a culinary journey through time. We will sit at the lavish banquet tables of the pharaohs, but we will also break bread with the common farmers and artisans. We will uncover the ingredients that grew from the Nile's black silt, explore the ancient techniques of the kitchen, and understand how a simple meal could be transformed into a political statement or a sacred ritual. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. All life in ancient Egypt, every loaf of bread, every jug of beer, every glistening joint of beef on a pharaoh's platter, was a direct gift of the Nile. The Egyptians themselves recognized this fundamental truth. They did not call their country Egypt. They called it Kemet, the Black Land, a name derived from the rich, dark, life-giving silt that was deposited by the river's annual flood. This fertile ribbon of black soil was a world of order and predictability, a stark contrast to the vast, terrifying expanse of the desert, the red land of the desert that surrounded them. The red land was the domain of chaos, death, and hostile forces. The Black Land was the cradle of their civilization, and its fertility was the ultimate source of the pharaoh's power. The entire rhythm of Egyptian life was dictated by the 3 seasons of the Nile, a cycle so predictable and essential that it formed the basis of their calendar. The year began with the season of Akhet, the inundation, which typically lasted from June to September. During this time, the great river, swollen with the monsoon rains from the Ethiopian highlands far to the south, would swell beyond its banks. It submerged the surrounding floodplains in a gentle, predictable flood, covering the land with several feet of water. To the modern eye, a massive landscape-altering flood might seem like a catastrophe, but for the Egyptians, it was the miracle upon which their existence depended. Unlike the violent and unpredictable floods of the Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia, the Nile's inundation was a reliable blessing. It brought not just water, but a fresh, thick layer of incredibly fertile topsoil, rich in the minerals and organic matter necessary for abundant crops. There was no need for complex, large-scale irrigation systems or the fear of soil salinization that plagued other early civilizations. The Nile did the heavy lifting during Akhet. All agricultural work came to a standstill. The fields were underwater, a vast, placid lake under the Egyptian sun. This was not a time of idleness for the population, however. It was during these months that the pharaoh could call upon a massive available workforce. This was the time for great national projects. The state conscripted farmers into labor gangs, not as slaves, but as citizens paying their tax through labor. They were fed from centralized storehouses and put to work quarrying stone, hauling blocks, and raising the great pyramids, temples, and tombs that still awe us today. The inundation, therefore, not only fertilized the land, but also provided the very means to build the monumental architecture that defined the kingdom as the floodwaters began to recede around October. The second season, Pharaoh, the season of emergence or growing, would begin. This was a period of intense and hopeful activity. The newly deposited black mud was soft, moist, and easy to work. Teams of oxen or donkeys, and sometimes men themselves, would pull simple wooden plows, known as ards, through the soil. These plows did not turn the soil over, but simply cut a shallow furrow into the soft mud, which was all that was needed to prepare it for seeding. Once the furrows were cut, sowers would walk the fields, their movements captured in the timeless reliefs of tombs like that of the 18th dynasty noble Nacht. They would cast seeds from wicker baskets held at their waists, a rhythmic, sweeping motion that had been practiced for millennia. In a wonderfully symbiotic display of ancient farming, herds of sheep or goats were often driven across the freshly sown fields. Their hooves served a crucial purpose. They trampled the seeds firmly into the moist earth, which protected them from the scorching sun and from being eaten by hungry birds. The primary and most essential crops were emmer wheat and barley. Emmer was a tough, ancient variety of wheat with a hard husk. It was the cornerstone of the Egyptian diet, a hardy grain well suited to the climate. Its gluten content, while lower than modern bread wheat, was sufficient to allow for the creation of the world's first leavened bread, a culinary revolution. Barley was equally important. It was a versatile grain, also used for bread, but its most critical role was as the essential ingredient for the national beverage, beer. These two products, bread and beer, were more than just food and drink. They were the foundation of the Egyptian economy. Laborers on state projects, soldiers in the army, and officials in the bureaucracy were all paid in rations of bread and beer. The amount of a person's ration was a direct reflection of their status in the rigid social hierarchy. A simple laborer might receive a few loaves and a jug of beer, while a high-ranking official or a priest would command a far greater share, befitting their exalted station. The third and final season was Shemu, the season of harvest or low water, which ran from roughly February to May. This was a time of back-breaking labor under the increasingly hot Egyptian sun. Reapers would move through the fields in organized lines, cutting the stalks of grain with curved sickles. These sickles were typically made of wood, with sharp, serrated flint blades set into them with resin. Tomb paintings provide a vivid window into this world, showing workers often stripped to the waist, their bodies glistening with sweat, methodically cutting down the golden fields of wheat. They are often depicted with a water carrier nearby, a small but poignant reminder of the harsh conditions. Once cut, the grain was bundled into sheaves and transported from the fields to the village threshing floors, usually by donkeys. The threshing floor was a flat, hard-packed circular area where the grain would be spread out. Blindfolded oxen, prevented from becoming dizzy, would be driven in endless circles over the stalks, their heavy hooves breaking the heads of grain and separating the valuable kernels from the straw. Following the threshing, the process of winnowing began. On a breezy day, workers, often women, would use wooden scoops or shovels to toss the mixture of grain, chaff, and straw into the air. The heavier grain would fall straight back to the floor, while the lighter chaff and straw would be carried away by the wind. It was a simple but effective form of sorting that required skill and a keen understanding of the prevailing winds. Finally, the cleaned grain was meticulously measured and recorded by ever-present scribes. Scribes were the agents of the state, the temple, or the wealthy landowner, and their job was to ensure that every last kernel was accounted for. The grain was then transported to tall, beehive-shaped granaries for storage. These structures were designed with raised floors and sealed entrances to keep the grain dry and as safe as possible from pests like rats and insects, ensuring a stable food supply for the year ahead. The surplus from a good harvest was the pharaoh's wealth, the foundation of the state's power. It could be used to feed the army, pay for monumental construction, trade with foreign lands for luxury goods like cedar wood from Lebanon or lapis, lazuli from Afghanistan, or, most importantly, be stored as a buffer against the possibility of a poor harvest in a future year. The biblical story of Joseph, who interprets the Pharaoh's dream and advises him to store grain during 7 years of plenty to survive 7 years of famine, reflects the deep-seated cultural awareness of the importance of grain storage and the precarious balance of life along the Nile. Even a slight variation in the height of the inundation, too low and the fields would not be watered, too high and it could destroy villages, could mean the difference between abundance and starvation. The pharaoh's role as the great provider, the one who ensured the granaries were full, was central to his legitimacy as king. In the grand culinary theater of ancient Egypt, two performers always took center stage. They were the protagonists of every meal, the foundation of every feast, and the very currency of the kingdom's economy. These were bread and beer. For the Kapmai, Pharaoh and the commoner alike, these were not just dietary staples. They were the very essence of life, civilization, and sustenance. The Egyptian language itself intertwined their existence. The common greeting, Pere Keru, which literally means that which comes forth by voice as an offering, was always a prayer for bread and beer, a phrase that encapsulated the core necessities for a good life in this world and the next. Their production was a daily ritual, a constant, humming industry in every temple, palace, and household. And at the royal court, the quality, variety, and sheer abundance of bread and beer were a direct measure of the kingdom's wealth and the pharaoh's divine power. The story of Egyptian bread is the story of a major leap forward in human culinary innovation, the invention of leavened bread. While simple, unleavened flatbreads existed in many ancient cultures, it was the Egyptians who first systematically harnessed the power of yeast to create light, airy, risen loaves. This remarkable discovery was made possible by the unique properties of the emmer wheat that grew so abundantly along the Nile. Emmer contained just enough of the protein gluten to trap the carbon dioxide gases produced by fermentation, allowing the dough to rise. This happy accident of botany and geography changed the course of baking forever. The process began at the granary, where the stored wheat kernels were taken for processing. The first and most arduous step was to turn the hard kernels into flour. For much of Egyptian history, this was grueling work, typically performed by women who spent hours each day kneeling and grinding. In the Old and Middle Kingdoms, the primary tool was the saddle quern, a large, slightly concave stone on which the grinder would kneel, using a smaller rounded stone to push and pull the grain back and forth. It was an inefficient, labor-intensive method that often introduced significant amounts of grit from the grinding stones and sand from the desert environment into the flour. The persistent presence of these abrasive particles is tragically evident in the severe dental attrition observed in countless Egyptian mummies. Their teeth were often worn down to the pulp from a lifetime of chewing this gritty bread, leading to abscesses, infections, and chronic pain. By the New Kingdom, the technology had improved with the introduction of the conical rotary quern, which was more efficient, but still required significant physical effort. In the kitchens of the pharaohs' palace, however, one can imagine a far higher standard of production. A larger workforce would have been dedicated to milling, and it is highly probable that the flour destined for the royal table underwent a more rigorous sifting process. Fine linen cloths would have been used as sieves to remove as much of the coarse bran and abrasive grit as possible. This would produce a whiter, finer flour, the ancient equivalent of modern pastry flour, resulting in a softer, lighter, and more refined loaf of world away from the coarse, dense bread of a common laborer. Once the flour was produced, it was mixed with water and sometimes salt to form a dough. It is at this stage that the magic of leavening happened. The Egyptians likely discovered fermentation by accident, when a batch of dough was left out and began to bubble and rise on its own due to the action of wild yeast spores from the air. Over time, they learned to control this process. They could create a more reliable and consistent result by using a sourdough starter or a mother dough, a piece of living fermented dough saved from a previous batch, which was rich in active yeast. An even more common source of yeast was the barm, the thick, frothy foam that formed on top of fermenting beer. This highlights the fundamental, almost symbiotic relationship between the baker and the brewer in ancient Egypt. They were two sides of the same coin, often working in adjacent workshops within the great households and temples. They shared ingredients, tools, and, most importantly, the vital culture of yeast that gave both of their products their unique character and cultural significance. The variety of Egyptian bread was astonishing, a testament to a vibrant and creative baking tradition that went far beyond simple sustenance. Archaeological evidence from preserved bread loaves found in tombs, combined with detailed tomb reliefs and offering lists, has revealed over 40 different types of loaves. They came in all shapes and sizes: conical, round, triangular, oval, and even intricately shaped like animals, human figures, or divine symbols for ritual purposes. The shape was often determined by the mold in which the bread was baked. Conical pottery molds were particularly common. The dough would be placed inside the preheated mold, which was then set in hot embers to bake, resulting in a cone-shaped loaf that was easy to handle and portion. Some breads were simple, everyday fare, while others were enriched to create luxurious delicacies for the royal table. Honey, a precious commodity, was a favorite sweetener. Milk, butter, and eggs could be added to create a richer, more cake-like dough. Spices like cumin, coriander, and dill were kneaded in to add savory flavors, and fruits like dates, figs, and even pomegranate seeds were incorporated to create sweet, complex, and flavorful creations reserved for the elite. Imagine a royal breakfast consisting of a warm, soft loaf, sweetened with date paste and studded with chopped nuts, a true luxury that showcased the wealth and taste of the court. Just as important as bread was its liquid counterpart, beer, or henket, as the Egyptians called it. Beer was the national drink, a source of nutrition, refreshment, and mild intoxication for all social classes, from the king down to the humblest farmer. It was often safer to drink than potentially contaminated water from canals, and was so thick and nutritious that it was considered a type of liquid food, a fundamental part of the daily ration. The brewing process was intricately linked with baking, so much so that the two crafts were often depicted together. The standard method began with the creation of beer bread, a dough typically from barley, but sometimes emmer, was lightly baked just enough to form a crust while leaving the inside moist and full of active enzymes and yeast. This special bread was then crumbled into a large vat and mixed with water to increase the sugar content and thus the alcohol level for a stronger or sweeter brew. Some brewers might add date or malt syrup to this mash. The mixture was then left to ferment in large ceramic vats. The amylase enzymes from the lightly baked bread would break down the starches in the grain into fermentable sugars, and the yeast, either from the bread itself or added separately from a previous batch, would convert these sugars into alcohol and carbon dioxide. The resulting liquid was a thick, soupy, and highly nutritious concoction, more like a thin alcoholic porridge than the clear, filtered beer we know today. It had a relatively low alcohol content, probably around 3 to 4% for standard beer, and was consumed daily by everyone, including children, as a key source of calories and B vitamins. To make it more palatable, the thick brew was often strained through a sieve or a cloth bag to remove the solid dregs and pieces of bread. The final product could be flavored with various additives. While hops were not used as a preservative and flavoring agent until much later in history, the Egyptians experimented with other ingredients. Date syrup was common for sweetness, while herbs like coriander or spices could add different aromatic characteristics. There is even some textual evidence to suggest the use of mandrake or other psychoactive plants in certain ceremonial beers, though this was likely not for everyday consumption. For the pharaoh's court, brewing was elevated to a fine art. The royal breweries were large-scale facilities, producing a beverage far superior to the common henket. They used the best quality barley, the purest water, and more complex guarded recipes. Different types of beer were produced, varying in strength, color, and flavor. Inscriptions mention various kinds, such as sweet beer, thick beer, friends, beer, and a beer of truth used in religious ceremonies. The beer destined for the pharaoh's cup would have been more carefully filtered, resulting in a smoother drink, and it may have been aged or flavored in special ways. Jars of beer for the pharaoh would be sealed with heavy clay stoppers, sometimes stamped with the mark of the brewery and the date of production, indicating a sophisticated system of quality control and administration that mirrored their wine production. Together, bread and beer were the absolute economic and nutritional backbone of the kingdom. The state-run system of ration payments meant that the pharaoh's control over the granaries, bakeries, and breweries was a direct form of control over the population. By providing this fundamental sustenance, the pharaoh fulfilled his role as the great provider, the shepherd of his people. At the royal banquets, the sheer variety and quality of the bread and beer on offer were a display of this power on a grand scale. A table laden with dozens of different breads, from simple flatbreads for scooping up stews to elaborate honey-sweetened cakes, accompanied by jugs of the finest Specially brewed beers sent a clear message to all who witnessed it. It was a message of abundance, of prosperity, and of a civilization that had mastered the gifts of the Nile. The humble loaf and the simple brew were transformed in the palace into symbols of divine authority and earthly power, the foundational flavors of a truly royal feast. While the story of Egyptian food is often dominated by the grand staples of bread and beer and the luxurious meats of the royal table, the true foundation of the daily diet for most Egyptians was the vibrant and varied produce pulled from the nation's fertile gardens and fields. Vegetables and legumes formed the colorful, flavorful, and nutritious heart of most meals, providing essential vitamins, minerals, and the bulk of the protein for the common population. For the Pharaoh and his court, this everyday bounty was elevated, prepared with greater care, and presented as part of a much larger culinary tapestry. The story of these humble plants is a crucial hidden treasure, revealing not just what people ate, but how they seasoned their lives and nourished their bodies. At the very top of the vegetable hierarchy, forming the holy trinity of Egyptian flavor, were onions, garlic, and leeks. These members of the allium family were ubiquitous, cultivated in vast quantities, and consumed by all social classes. It is difficult to overstate their importance. They were the foundational flavor base for countless stews, soups, and roasted dishes. Tomb paintings frequently depict workers in the fields being presented with bundles of onions, and offering lists invariably include them. Onions were so central to the diet that they even took on a religious significance. Their layered, concentric structure was seen as a symbol of eternity and the universe, and they were used as offerings to the gods. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, famously noted that the inscriptions on the Great Pyramid recorded the vast sums spent on radishes, onions, and garlic for the laborers, a detail that, while likely apocryphal, correctly identifies these vegetables as the fuel that powered the workforce. The pungent, sharp flavor of raw garlic and onions, and the sweet, mellow flavor they developed when cooked, were the taste of Egypt itself. Beyond this essential trio, Egyptian gardens produced a wide array of other vegetables. Lettuce was extremely common, but it was a different variety from the ones we know today. Egyptian lettuce was a tall, upright variety with a milky sap, and it held a powerful symbolic association with men, the god of male fertility and procreation. The milky substance was seen as being analogous to semen, and thus lettuce was considered a potent aphrodisiac and a symbol of generative power. It was often depicted in offering scenes and was a staple of both the dinner table and the temple. Cucumbers, a refreshing and hydrating food in the hot climate, were grown in abundance. Several types of gourds and melons, including the sweet watermelon, which originated in the region, were also cultivated. Root vegetables like radishes were common, as were leafy greens similar to cabbage and kale. One of the most important categories of produce, however, was the legume family. Lentils, chickpeas, and, most importantly, fava beans, also known as broad beans, were the primary source of protein for the vast majority of the population. They were easy to grow, could be dried and stored for long periods, and were highly nutritious. A simple stew of lentils or fava beans, seasoned with garlic and onions, and served with a piece of coarse bread, would have been the standard, life-sustaining meal for millions of Egyptians for millennia. Even in the palace, these humble legumes were not scorned. They could be pureed into savory pastes, served as side dishes, or incorporated into more complex stews, providing an earthy and satisfying element to the meal. The cultivation of these vegetables and legumes took place in dedicated garden plots. Unlike the vast, open grain fields that were dependent on the annual flood, these gardens often required more intensive year-round care and a different system of irrigation. They were typically located on slightly higher ground, near the village or household, and were watered by hand. A common irrigation tool, depicted in countless tomb scenes, was the shaduf. This was a simple but ingenious counterweight lift, consisting of a long pole pivoted on a central support. A bucket was attached to a rope on the long end, and a heavy weight, often a large lump of clay, was fixed to the short end. A worker could easily pull the bucket down to the level of a canal or well, fill it with water, and then allow the counterweight to do the work of lifting the water up to the level of the garden, where it would be emptied into a network of small irrigation channels. The shaduf made it possible to cultivate produce even during the dry season, ensuring a steady supply of fresh vegetables throughout the year. Once harvested, these vegetables needed to be cooked, and the primary medium for cooking was oil. The Egyptians had access to a variety of plant-based oils, each with its own uses and status. The most common and utilitarian oil was likely castor oil, derived from the castor bean. While toxic in its raw state, the oil could be processed to make it safe for use in lamps and perhaps for some rudimentary cooking, though its flavor would have been unpleasant. A higher quality and more common edible oil was sesame oil, pressed from sesame seeds which were widely cultivated. This oil had a pleasant, nutty flavor and was a staple in the kitchens of those who could afford it. Even more prized was moringa oil, extracted from the seeds of the moringa tree, which the Egyptians called the tree of life. This oil was valued not just for its fine quality and delicate flavor in cooking, but also as a base for perfumes, cosmetics, and medicinal ointments. It was a luxury product, likely found in the kitchens and cosmetic boxes of the elite. The most prestigious oil of all, however, was olive oil. While some olives were grown in Egypt, particularly in the Fayum Oasis and the Nile Delta, the finest olive oil was imported from the Levant, modern-day Syria, and Lebanon, and the Aegean. It was an expensive import, a true luxury reserved for the Pharaoh's table, the wealthiest nobles, and for the most sacred temple rituals, where it was used for anointing divine statues. In the palace kitchens, these oils were used in various ways. They could be used for frying to saute vegetables or to fry small cakes and pastries. They were used as a dressing for salads of fresh greens, perhaps mixed with a little vinegar or fruit juice. And they were used as a finishing element, drizzled over a finished stew or roast to add richness and flavor. Fats rendered from animals, particularly beef tallow and goose fat, were also a crucial cooking medium, especially for searing meat and adding a deep, savory flavor to dishes. The humble vegetables and legumes and the oils used to cook them are a treasure of information because they ground our understanding of Egyptian cuisine in reality. While it is tempting to focus solely on the spectacular, Feasts of the Pharaoh, the daily reality for almost everyone, was a plant-based diet. The genius of the Egyptian cook was in their ability to take a simple set of ingredients: onions, garlic, lentils, a little oil, and some herbs, and transform them into a nourishing and flavorful meal. The contents of the common pot, simmering over a hearth in a small mud-brick house, tell a story that is just as important as the one told by the grand platters of the royal banquet. It is a story of resilience, of making the most of the land's bounty, and of the enduring foundational flavors that sustain one of the world's greatest civilizations. While the fields and gardens provided the foundational sustenance for the Egyptian people, the true measure of wealth, power, and status was meat. The sizzle of roasting flesh and the rich, savory aroma of cooked protein were the definitive hallmarks of an elite feast, a daily luxury that set the world of the Pharaoh and his court worlds apart from the common populace. For the average Egyptian, meat was a rare treat, perhaps enjoyed only during major religious festivals. For the king, it was a daily rite and a key component of his symbolic role as the master of the created world. The acquisition, husbandry, and preparation of meat for the palace was a massive, complex operation, a vital state industry involving vast royal herds, sophisticated breeding and fattening techniques, and the highly ritualized and symbolic spectacle of the royal hunt. The most prestigious meat, the undisputed king of the royal menu, and the most desired offering for the gods, was beef. Throughout the ancient Near East, cattle were the primary symbol of wealth and power, and nowhere was this more true than in the land of the Nile. Large, magnificent herds were owned by the state, the great temples, and the highest-ranking nobles. These were not simply dairy cows. They were a direct measure of an institution's or an individual's capital. They were raised specifically for their meat, for their strength as draft animals in pulling plows and hauling stones for construction, and as sacrificial animals for the most important religious ceremonies. The tomb scenes, such as the incredibly detailed reliefs in the Old Kingdom mastaba of tea at Saqqara, provide a veritable encyclopedia of Egyptian animal husbandry. We see herdsmen with their long staffs tending to their cattle in the lush pastures of the Nile Delta, carefully helping cows give birth and leading the animals across canals, with some calves being carried on the herdsman's shoulders. The Egyptians were sophisticated breeders, and inscriptions and artistic depictions show us several distinct types of cattle. There were the majestic, long-horned Afrikaner-type cattle, celebrated for their beauty and strength, and a short-horned stockier variety that was likely bred specifically for its meat. The health and size of these herds were meticulously tracked by scribes. A regular cattle census was a major administrative event used to assess the wealth of the nation and calculate the taxes owed by landowners. The journey of an ox from the green pastures of the delta to the Pharaoh's plate was a long and carefully managed process. The finest animals, selected for their size and health, were often brought into special enclosures to be fattened for slaughter. This process, which the Egyptians called cramming, is explicitly depicted in many tomb reliefs. We see attendants holding an ox's head while forcing food-likely balls of moistened grain, bread, or legumes down its throat. The goal was to produce an animal with a higher fat content, resulting in more tender and flavorful meat, a true delicacy worthy of the royal palate. This practice underscores the elite's desire for specific culinary qualities and their ability to manipulate the natural world to achieve them. When the time came for slaughter, the event was not a mere chore, but a ritualized process carried out by specialized butchers known as sasu. The animal would be ritually purified, restrained with ropes, and its throat cut with a swift, efficient motion using a large flint or bronze knife. The blood was drained, and the carcass was then skillfully butchered into specific named cuts. The choicest portions, such as the tenderloin, the ribs, and especially the foreleg or haunch, the kepesh, were reserved for the offering table of the gods and the dining table of the pharaoh. The kepesh cut held particular ritual significance. In hieroglyphs, it was used to write the word for strength or power, and its presentation to the gods or the king was a symbolic transfer of this vital force. The most common method of cooking. This prized beef was roasting. Large cuts of meat were impaled on wooden spits and cooked slowly over open fires or charcoal braziers. Scenes of palatial kitchens show ranks of cooks tending to these roasts, fanning the flames with palm fronds, and turning the spits to ensure the meat cooked evenly. Other methods included boiling or stewing the meat with vegetables like onions and garlic in large ceramic pots, creating rich, savory broth that could be soaked up with bread. Salt, brought from the desert oases or the coastal lagoons of the delta, was the primary seasoning, used both to flavor the meat and to preserve it. Beef could be salted and dried in the arid air, creating a form of jerky sear that could be stored for long periods. This preserved meat was essential for supplying the army on campaigns or for provisioning the pharaoh's entourage when traveling far from the palace kitchens. Beyond beef, the Egyptians also raised sheep and goats. These animals were hardier and better adapted to the more marginal lands at the edge of the desert, and their meat was a more common part of the elite diet, though generally considered less prestigious than beef. Mutton and goat meat would have been the daily fare for lower-ranking officials and palace staff. A more notable and complex presence in the Egyptian diet was the pig. Pork was certainly eaten, particularly in the Old Kingdom and among the working classes, as evidenced by the vast number of pig bones found at the workers' village of Giza. However, its status was ambiguous and seemed to decline over time, especially in official religious contexts. Pigs were scavengers and were seen as unclean. More importantly, they became closely associated with the god Set, the chaotic and destructive brother of Osiris. In one version of the myth, Set took the form of a black pig to attack and wound the eye of Horus. This divine conflict gave pork a somewhat unclean or taboo status, making it unsuitable for the most sacred offering lists and, in all likelihood, for the pharaoh's formal dining hall. It was food for the workers, not for the gods or the king. The ultimate expression of the pharaoh's dominance over the natural world, however, was the royal hunt. This was less about sustenance and more about ritual, ideology, and pure spectacle. In countless temple reliefs, the pharaoh is depicted as a superhuman hero, standing effortlessly in his chariot at full gallop, his powerful bow drawn single-handedly felling a chaotic array of animals. The preferred targets were the creatures of the desert, the red land of the desert, which represented the forces of chaos, Isfet. By hunting them, the pharaoh was symbolically reenacting the triumph of divine order, Mat, over the untamed wild. The animals hunted for sport and prestige included wild bulls, oryx, gazelles, antelopes, and even lions. While lion meat was almost certainly not on the menu, the ability of the pharaoh to defeat the king of beasts was the ultimate demonstration of his superhuman strength and virility, a key piece of royal propaganda designed to awe his subjects and intimidate his enemies. The meat from the other desert game, however, such as gazelle and antelope, was highly prized for its lean, flavorful quality. It was a true delicacy, a taste of the wild and chaotic desert, tamed and brought to the pharaoh's orderly table. The hunt was a carefully orchestrated event, with large teams of beaters driving the terrified animals towards the pharaoh's waiting chariot, ensuring his success and reinforcing his divine mandate to rule. The resulting venison would be a celebrated addition to the royal banquet, a food imbued with the symbolic power of the pharaoh's victory. The protein on the pharaoh's plate was therefore a complex tapestry of flavors and meanings, a daily reminder of his absolute control over the animal kingdom, from the most placid, force-fed ox and its stall to the wildest antelope of the untamable desert. The pharaoh's mastery over the animal kingdom extended far beyond the herds of the pasture and the wild game of the desert. The two other great domains of the Egyptian landscape, the sky and the river, were also expected to yield their bounty for the royal table. The Nile's marshes teemed with an incredible diversity of bird life, while its waters churned with fish. This feathered and scaled harvest provided a vast and varied source of protein that was central to the Egyptian diet as a whole, but which was exploited and consumed in very different ways by the rich and the poor. For the pharaoh, poultry was a staple of the elite feast, while fish occupied a more complex and ambiguous position, caught between its status as commoner's food and its role in powerful religious taboos. The skies and marshes of Egypt were a paradise for waterfowl, a key stop on the great migratory routes between Africa and Europe. For the Egyptians, this translated into an abundant and readily available food source. The most important and prestigious of all fowl was the goose. Several species were native to Egypt, and they were raised in vast numbers. Roasted goose, with its rich, fatty meat and crispy skin, was the quintessential festive dish, the ancient Egyptian equivalent of the Christmas turkey. It appears constantly in offering lists and banquet scenes, a true delicacy that signaled celebration and abundance. Alongside geese, ducks were also a favorite, raised in large numbers for both their meat and their eggs. The palace and the great temple estates maintained enormous poultry yards, where thousands of these birds were kept. The noise and smell must have been overwhelming. As with cattle, the practice of force feeding or cramming was common to fatten the birds for the table. Tomb reliefs clearly show attendants holding birds, often geese or cranes, and pushing pellets of moistened grain down their throats. This was done to produce a larger, fattier liver, the world's first foie gras, and a more succulent meat, delicacies reserved for the most discerning elite palates. In addition to ducks and geese, the Egyptians kept domesticated pigeons and doves in tall, cone-shaped structures called dovecotes. These provided a steady supply of both small, tender birds, squabs, and eggs. The skies and marshes also offered a wild bounty that was exploited on an industrial scale. Quail, cranes, pelicans, and numerous species of wild duck and geese were all considered fair game. The primary method for catching these wild birds was not individual hunting with a bow, but the highly efficient use of massive clap nets. Detailed scenes in tombs like that of the nobleman Nebamun show this process. In vivid detail, a team of men would hide in the dense papyrus thickets of the marsh, holding the ropes to a massive rectangular net that was laid out over a pool of water. When a large flock of birds landed to feed, a foreman, often depicted clapping his hands, or giving a silent signal, would give the order. The men would then pull the ropes in unison, causing the two halves of the net to snap shut with incredible speed, trapping hundreds of birds at once. This was not sport. It was a large-scale food gathering operation designed to supply the insatiable demands for the elite households. The captured birds would then be brought back in large wicker cages. Some would be slaughtered immediately for the kitchen, while others, particularly cranes and wild geese, would be added to the poultry yards to be tamed and fattened, while birds were a celebrated part of the elite diet. The other great harvest, that of the river, held a more complex status. For the vast majority of the Egyptian population, fish was the primary source of animal protein. It was an abundant, affordable daily staple that sustained the millions of farmers, craftsmen, and laborers who formed the base of the social pyramid. The Nile ecosystem supported a huge variety of fish species. The most commonly consumed was the Nile tilapia, a fish so central to Egyptian life that it became a powerful symbol of rebirth and regeneration. The Egyptians had closely observed its fascinating life cycle, in which the female holds her eggs and the young fry in her mouth to protect them. Seeing the fully formed young eventually emerge from their mother's mouth, they associated the tilapia with creation and spontaneous generation, linking it to the sun god Ai. Amulets in the shape of tilapia were extremely popular, worn by the living for protection and placed with the dead to aid in their journey to the afterlife. Other important species included the massive Nile perch, which could grow to over 6 feet long, the sharp-toothed tigerfish, various species of catfish, and the prized mullet, which was valued not just for its flesh but especially for its roe. Methods used to catch these fish were diverse and ingenious. For large-scale commercial fishing, teams would use large seine nets, dragged through a section of the river by men wading in the shallows or working from 2 boats. For individual fishermen, a cast net weighted around the edges could be skillfully thrown over a promising spot. In the shallow, clear waters of the marshes, fishermen used multi-pronged harpoons and spears with deadly accuracy, a practice often depicted as a noble pastime in tomb paintings. Once caught, the fish had to be processed quickly in the Egyptian heat. For immediate consumption, it could be roasted over a fire or boiled in stews, but preservation was key. The most common method was salting and drying. Fish were split open, cleaned, and then rubbed with coarse salt before being laid out on racks to dry in the sun. The resulting dried fish was a staple food product traded throughout Egypt, a particularly prized delicacy. Likely reserved for the elite was salted fish roe, the ancient equivalent of caviar. The roe of the mullet was carefully extracted, salted, pressed into cakes, and then dried, creating a luxury product with a concentrated, savory flavor dot. despite its availability. Fish occupied a surprisingly ambiguous place in the upper echelons of Egyptian society. There was a certain snobbery among the high elite regarding fish as commoners' food, something that filled the bellies of the poor, but was not truly fit for a noble's table. More significantly, certain fish were subject to powerful religious taboos. Some species were considered sacred to particular gods and were therefore forbidden to be eaten, at least in certain regions or by certain classes of people. The most famous example is the oxyrhynchus fish, which, according to myth, was one of the creatures that ate the phallus of the god Osiris after he was dismembered by his brother Set. To eat this fish was to participate in the desecration of the god of resurrection, an unthinkable act. The Greek historian Herodotus noted that priests were forbidden from eating fish altogether to maintain their state of ritual purity. The Pharaoh, as the high priest of every cult in Egypt and a living god himself, almost certainly adhered to these priestly restrictions, at least on a formal and ceremonial level. His formal banquets and the sacred offerings made in his name to the other gods would have focused exclusively on the ritually clean and high-status meats like beef and poultry. Fish was simply not appropriate for the divine sphere. However, it is hard to imagine that the palace kitchens ignored this resource completely. It is highly likely that fish was prepared for the wider royal household, for the thousands of officials, scribes, and servants who lived and worked in the palace complex, and in the privacy of his own chambers, away from the demands of public ritual. It is entirely possible that the pharaoh himself may have enjoyed the delicate taste of a perfectly grilled tilapia. The river's harvest was simply too abundant to ignore a constant and reliable source of sustenance that flowed, like the Nile itself, through all levels of the civilization, even if it was rarely allowed to cross the threshold of the temple or the pharaoh's sacred offering table. In a world without the pervasive presence of sugar cane or sugar beets, the human craving for sweetness was satisfied by the subtle, seasonal, and often precious gifts of nature. For the ancient Egyptians, and especially for the pharaoh and his court, sweet flavors were the ultimate luxury, a taste of paradise in an often harsh and arid landscape. The desserts and sweet delicacies that graced the royal table were not simple afterthoughts, but sophisticated creations, testaments to the skill of Egyptian gardeners, the daring of their beekeepers, and the ingenuity of their cooks. These treats, based on the concentrated sugars of fruits and the golden elixir of honey, were the perfect opulent finale to a royal feast, and their presence in the tomb was an essential provision for a sweet and pleasurable afterlife. The primary and most accessible sources of sweetness were fruits, cultivated with great care in the lush, irrigated orchards and gardens that belonged to the temples and the royal estates. The undisputed king of Egyptian fruits was the date. The date palm was a miraculous tree in the eyes of the Egyptians, a symbol of fertility and life that thrived in the hot, dry climate where other plants might wither. It was a complete resource, providing not only its energy-rich fruit, but also wood for construction, strong fibers for rope, and fronds for weaving baskets and roofing houses. Dates themselves were a powerhouse of nutrition and concentrated sweetness. They could be eaten fresh from the tree, a soft, luscious treat with a delicate flavor. More commonly, They were left to dry in the sun, a process which intensified their sugary flavor and acted as a natural preservative, allowing them to be stored for months. These dried dates were the workhorse sweetener of the Egyptian kitchen, used in a huge variety of dishes. They could be chopped and kneaded into bread dough to create sweet loaves and cakes. They could be steeped in water and then pressed through a sieve or cloth to create a thick, sweet syrup known as date honey, which was used to sweeten drinks and other dishes. Or they could simply be eaten on their own as a simple, satisfying dessert. They were the everyday sweet treat, accessible to many, but the quality and sheer quantity available to the pharaoh were, as with all things, unparalleled. The finest, plumpest dates from the royal estates, from varieties cultivated for their superior flavor, were reserved for his table. Alongside dates, figs were another cherished fruit. Both the common fig and the sycamore fig were cultivated, and the latter held a particularly deep religious significance. The sycamore fig was believed to be the sacred tree from which the sky goddess Nut, the protector of the dead, would emerge to offer food and drink to the souls of the deceased, nourishing them and aiding them on their perilous journey to the afterlife. For this reason, sycamore fig trees were often planted near tombs as a living promise of eternal sustenance. Figs, like dates, could be eaten fresh or dried, and their soft texture and honey-like flavor made them a popular ingredient in sweet preparations. They were often combined with dates and other ingredients, such as chopped nuts or spices, to create an early form of energy bar. This dense, sweet cake was not only a dessert, but also a nutritious and highly portable food source, perfect for travelers or soldiers on campaign. Grapes were the third pillar of Egyptian fruit cultivation. While grown primarily for the production of wine, a high-status beverage, they were also enjoyed as a fresh fruit. They were grown on elaborate trellises in meticulously tended vineyards, mostly located in the fertile, waterlogged soil of the Nile Delta, while the majority of the harvest was destined for the wine press. Great bunches of fresh, juicy grapes would have certainly been served at royal banquets, offering a burst of cool, refreshing sweetness and a visual feast for the eyes. When dried in the sun, grapes were transformed into raisins, another concentrated source of sugar that could be used in baking or enjoyed as a simple, sweet snack. Other fruits grown in Egypt included the pomegranate, with its tough, leathery skin protecting jewel-like sacs of tartly sweet juice; the dong palm fruit, which had a hard, edible rind that tasted somewhat like gingerbread and was often ground into a powder; and various types of melons, including watermelons, which were prized for their ability to provide both sweetness and hydration in the hot climate. However, the most prized, most revered, and most luxurious sweetener of all was honey. Honey was a magical substance, a gift from the bees that seemed to be a distillation of sunlight and flowers. It was far rarer and more difficult to obtain than fruit sugars, and was therefore a product of immense prestige, largely reserved for offerings to the gods, medicinal preparations, and the exclusive use of the pharaoh and his court. The Egyptians were among the world's first known beekeepers. While some honey was certainly collected from wild hives found in rocky crevices or trees, a risky and often destructive process, the Egyptians also practiced organized apiculture on a large scale. By the Old Kingdom, they had developed horizontal, cylindrical hives made of piped clay or a mixture of river mud and straw. These hives could be stacked in large apiaries. The honey could be harvested by combing the bees with the smoke from a smoldering piece of dung or incense, and then carefully removing the honeycomb from one end of the cylinder without destroying the entire colony. This sophisticated process is beautifully illustrated in the tomb of Babasa, a high official from the 26th dynasty. The reliefs show beekeepers tending to their stacked cylindrical hives, using ceramic smokers to pacify the bees, and then extracting the heavy honeycomb. The comb was then crushed and pressed, likely in a cloth sack that was twisted to squeeze out the precious liquid honey. The honey was then sealed in pottery jars, often with a label indicating its quality or origin, ready for use. It was a valuable commodity, a key ingredient in religious rituals and a base for many medical prescriptions due to its natural antibacterial properties. But its ultimate role was as the supreme luxury sweetener in the kitchens of the pharaoh. The beeswax, a valuable byproduct, was not wasted. It was used in cosmetics, for sealing documents, as a component in shipbuilding, and most importantly, in the lost wax casting method for creating intricate metal sculptures at the royal court. Honey was used to create a range of desserts and sweetmeats that showcased the chef's skill. The most common form of dessert was a type of sweet cake or pastry. A base dough of fine wheat or barley flour could be enriched with milk, butter, and eggs, and then sweetened with a generous amount of honey. This mixture would often be combined with chopped dates, figs, or ground nuts like the tiger nut. These cakes were then baked, perhaps in special decorative molds, or fried in oil or animal fat, resulting in something akin to a donut or fritter, which could then be drizzled with even more honey or date syrup for a final glossy sheen. A popular delicacy known as taijet consisted of roasted tiger nuts, which are not true nuts but small, sweet tubers that were then chopped and mixed with honey. This mixture was formed into small cakes or balls, a simple but elegant confection that provided a delightful crunch. The presentation of these desserts was as important as their taste. They would be arranged artfully on platters of pottery or even alabaster, perhaps decorated with fresh flowers, pomegranate seeds, or slices of fig. They were a beautiful and tempting end to a lavish meal. The sweetness itself was a symbol of the richness and pleasure of life, a stark contrast to the bitterness of death. This is precisely why honey and sweet foods were so important in a funerary context. Tombs were provisioned with sealed jars of honey, plates of sweet cakes, and baskets of fruit to ensure that the deceased would have access to these pleasures for all eternity. The tomb of Tutankhamun, for example, contained jars that still held traces of honey, a sweet promise preserved for over 3,000 years. It is important to remember that the Egyptian palate was likely very different from our modern one, which is accustomed to highly refined sugars. In a world where sweetness was a rare luxury, the simple taste of a ripe fig or a handful of dates was a significant pleasure. The desserts of the pharaohs were not cloyingly sweet by today's standards. They were a delicate and complex balance of the natural sugars from fruits and the intense floral notes of wild honey, combined with the earthy flavors of grain and nuts. They were a celebration of the natural bounty of Egypt, transformed through skill and care into a food fit for a king. The beverages that filled the Pharaoh's cup were as laden with status, ritual, and meaning as the food that graced his plate. In a kingdom where the daily ration for millions consisted of bread and beer, the act of drinking was rarely simple. While the general population quenched their thirst and found their cheer in the ubiquitous and nutritious brew of the masses, the upper echelons of society, and the pharaoh at his pinnacle, had access to a cellar of far greater variety, refinement, and symbolic power. From the sacred wine of the delta vineyards to the meticulously purified water of the Nile, to the nourishing luxury of milk and exotic fruit juices, what the pharaoh drank was a potent statement of his power, his ritual purity, and his intimate connection to the divine, the undisputed king of elite beverages that drink of the gods and of royalty was wine. In the strict social hierarchy of Egyptian drinks, if beer was the dependable, hard-working foot soldier of the nation, wine was the triumphant, decorated general parading its prestige. Its production was a complex and resource-intensive process, largely restricted to the fertile, waterlogged marshlands of the Nile Delta, with a few other notable wine-producing regions like the western oases, such as Karga and Dakla, and the area around Lake Mareotis near Alexandria and later periods. This geographical limitation immediately made wine a scarcer and therefore more valuable commodity than the barley that could be grown up and down the length of the Nile. The vineyards themselves were sophisticated agricultural enterprises, belonging almost exclusively to the state, the great temples, or the wealthiest nobles. Grapevines were carefully tended, often by highly skilled gardeners, and trained to grow on purpose-built trellises. This practice lifted the precious fruit off the damp ground, improving air circulation, preventing rot, and making the harvest easier. This required a significant investment in infrastructure and specialized labor, further elevating the status of the final product. The winemaking process, from harvest to fermentation, is documented in stunning and lively detail in numerous tomb paintings, particularly from the New Kingdom period. The harvest, or vendange, is shown as a joyous but labor-intensive time. Workers are depicted carefully hand-picking ripe bunches of grapes and placing them into woven baskets. The baskets were then carried on their shoulders to the fermentation vats. These were large circular enclosures, either carved from stone or built from brick and lined with plaster to make them waterproof. Once the vat was filled with grapes, the treading began. Teams of men, often depicted holding onto ropes or bars suspended from a frame above them for balance and support, would stomp on the grapes with their bare feet to crush them and release their juice. This was often a festive occasion, accompanied by music from a flute player and rhythmic singing, which likely helped the workers to keep a steady, efficient pace. The resulting grape juice, or must, a frothy purple river, would flow through a spout into smaller collecting vats or directly into pottery jars. From here, the must was decanted into large pottery amphorae for fermentation. These were the barrels of the ancient world. The wild yeasts present on the grape skins would immediately begin their work, voraciously converting the natural sugars in the juice into alcohol and carbon dioxide. The amphorae were left open or lightly covered with a cloth during the vigorous primary fermentation to allow the gas to escape without causing the vessel to explode. After this initial phase subsided, the jars were sealed with heavy clay stoppers, which were often impressed with a seal identifying the estate. A small hole, sometimes containing a straw, was often left in the stopper to allow for the release of any remaining gas from the secondary fermentation. It is in the sealing and labeling of these jars that the true sophistication of the Egyptian wine industry is revealed. Many wine jars discovered in tombs, most famously in the treasure trove of Tutankhamun's burial, bear detailed inscriptions in hieratic, a cursive form of hieroglyphs. These ancient labels record an astonishing amount of information. They list the year of the harvest, always dated to the regnal year of the current pharaoh, the type of wine, such as sweet wine or simply good quality wine, the name and location of the vineyard, for example, the vineyard of the house of Aten from the Western River, and even the name of the chief vintner responsible for its production. This is the ancient equivalent of a modern appellation controllee system, indicating a vibrant culture of connoisseurship, where the quality of specific vintages, estates, and winemakers was recognized, prized, and carefully tracked. The Egyptians produced a variety of wines. While red wine, symbolically linked to the blood of Osiris, seems to have been the most common and ceremonially important, they also made white wine and possibly a pinkish or rose style. Wines could also be classified by their sweetness. Some were likely fermented until they were dry, while others were made to be deliberately sweet, perhaps by using very ripe grapes, adding a sweetener like honey or date syrup, or halting fermentation early. The pharaoh's personal cellars would have been stocked with hundreds of these amphorae, containing the finest vintages from the most renowned estates in the kingdom. Wine was the centerpiece of royal banquets and a key component of religious liturgy. It was offered to the gods in temple rituals, poured into libation bowls to honor the dead, and included in vast quantities in funerary endowments. While wine was the drink of celebration, the most fundamental beverage was water. However, access to clean, safe water was a constant concern. While the Nile gave life its waters, especially in stagnant canals or pools left by the receding flood, could harbor dangerous parasites and bacteria, causing diseases like dysentery. The safest sources were deep wells or the main flowing current of the river, but even this could be murky with silt. For the pharaoh, ensuring the purity of his drinking water was a matter of health and state security. The water he drank would have been carefully sourced from the cleanest possible location and then clarified to remove all sediment. The most common method for this was to let the water stand in large pottery vessels, allowing the silt to settle to the bottom before carefully decanting the clearer water from the top. It is also possible they used siphons made of reeds to draw off the clean water without disturbing the sediment. Some scholars have suggested that they may have used clarifying agents like powdered alum or ground almonds, which act as flocculants, to help purify the water more quickly, though direct evidence for this is scarce. What is certain is that the water served in the palace would have been the cleanest and purest available in the entire kingdom. Milk was another important beverage, though it was considered more of a food than a simple thirst quencher due to its nutritional density. Cattle were the primary source of milk for the palace, but goats' and sheep's milk were also consumed. Milk was a powerful symbol of nourishment and motherhood, closely associated with goddesses like Hathor, often depicted as a cow, and Isis. The pyramid texts Some of the oldest religious writings in the world speak of the deceased king suckling directly from the breast of a goddess to be reborn into the afterlife. This potent imagery underscores the life-giving, divine properties attributed to milk. For the living Pharaoh, the consumption of fresh milk was a luxury. In a hot climate without refrigeration, fresh milk would spoil very quickly, within hours. Its availability was therefore a sign of immediate access to a productive, healthy herd. The palace would have had its own dairy, providing a fresh supply daily for the royal family. Milk was also used to produce other dairy products like a form of soft cheese or yogurt, which would have preserved the vital nutrients for a longer period. Finally, the royal court enjoyed a variety of other beverages, often based on fruit. The juices of pomegranates, grapes, and figs could be enjoyed fresh, providing a sweet, vitamin-rich, and refreshing drink. A particularly popular and high-status beverage was sheda, a drink mentioned in many texts whose exact nature was long debated by scholars. For a time it was thought to be a pomegranate wine or a form of cider. However, recent scientific analysis of organic residue from amphorae explicitly labeled as shuda from Tutankhamun's tomb has provided a clearer answer. The analysis revealed that it was made from red grapes, but processed in a specific way that distinguished it from regular wine. It seems the grapes were either heated or partially dried in the sun before being pressed, concentrating their sugars and flavors. This would have resulted in a very sweet, potent, and syrupy beverage, perhaps more akin to a port or a dessert. Wine. Whatever its precise recipe, sheda was clearly a luxury product, another jewel in the pharaoh's well-stocked cellar, demonstrating a desire for variety and novelty even within the world of wine. The grand feasts and daily meals of the pharaoh were not conjured from thin air by magic, though their opulence might have suggested it. They were the end product of a highly organized, bustling, and surprisingly sophisticated culinary operation. Located deep within the palace complex, the royal kitchen was a world unto itself, a sprawling department that functioned with the precision of a small army. It had a large, hierarchical staff of specialized cooks, butchers, bakers, and brewers, all working with a range of purpose-built tools and time-honored techniques to transform the raw bounty of Egypt into meals worthy of a living god. Our knowledge of these kitchens comes from a combination of sources: the archaeological remains of palace and temple kitchens, which revealed their layout and scale, the vibrant, detailed scenes of food preparation that adorn the walls of so many tombs, and the administrative papyri that list the vast quantities of supplies consumed. The heart of the palace food operation was not a single, enclosed room as we might imagine it, but rather a collection of specialized workshops, many of which were open-air courtyards to allow for ventilation and the dissipation of smoke and heat. This design was crucial for handling the massive scale of production required to feed the royal family, the court, government officials, servants, and guards a population that could number in the thousands. A key area would have been the butchery, an abattoir within the palace walls. This was undoubtedly an open-air courtyard, probably located on the periphery of the complex, for reasons of hygiene and smell. Here, the cattle, goats, and other livestock delivered as taxes or from the royal herds would meet their end. Specialized butchers, the sasu, using sharp bronze knives for cutting and heavy axes for bone breaking, would expertly dismember the carcasses. They worked with practiced efficiency, separating the prized cuts like the foreleg and ribs from the lesser parts, which would be allocated to lower-ranking staff. Nothing was wasted. Sinews were saved for cordage, and hides were sent to tanneries. Another dedicated area was the poultry workshop. Given the Egyptian elite's fondness for fowl, this would have been a constantly busy, noisy, and feather-strewn place. Here, the thousands of ducks, geese, pigeons, and wild birds were killed, plucked, drawn, and prepared for the cooks. This was a less skilled but still vital job, likely performed by a large team of junior workers adjacent to these areas, and central to the entire operation were the bakery and the brewery. These were the twin pillars of the Egyptian food economy, and their workshops were often located close together due to their shared reliance on grain from the royal granaries and the use of yeast starter from one process in the other. The bakery was a complex facility. It would have featured grinding rooms where workers, usually women, toiled at the querns to produce flour. There were large mixing areas with massive pottery bowls for kneading dough, and finally, the ovens. Egyptian ovens were typically tall, conical structures made of thick clay. A fire was lit inside to heat the ceramic walls to a high temperature, after which the embers and ash were raked out. The shaped loaves of dough were then slapped directly onto the hot interior walls to bake, a technique still used for tandoor ovens today. Another common method involved using preheated pottery molds, especially for the ubiquitous conical loaves, which were placed directly in the hot embers of a hearth. The main cooking area, what we would recognize as the kitchen proper, was a hub of controlled chaos. It was likely a large, high-roofed chamber, perhaps with clerestory windows or openings near the ceiling to allow some of the immense heat and smoke to escape. There were no modern stoves or ranges. Instead, cooking was done over open fires and on raised brick hearths. These hearths could be simple, open constructions for roasting spits or more complex, multi-level structures with built-in cavities for holding fuel and openings on top where cooking pots could be placed. The fuel was primarily wood or charcoal, with charcoal being the preferred option for a consistent, less smoky heat, though it required its own dedicated workshop to produce. Dried animal dung was also a common fuel source, particularly in areas where wood was scarcer. The cookware of the Pharaoh's kitchen was almost entirely ceramic. Egyptian potters produced a vast and functional array of vessels for culinary use. Large, wide-mouthed bowls for mixing and serving, round-bottomed cooking, pots designed to sit stably on the ash of a hearth or on a ceramic pot stand, and specialized sealed jars for beer, wine, and oil. These pots were functional and durable enough for daily use, but their constant exposure to thermal shock meant breakages were common, creating a steady demand for the potter's craft. Metal cookware was exceedingly rare. While the elite had access to bronze, it was a valuable alloy of copper and tin, which had to be imported, and its use was largely reserved for tools, weapons, and luxury items. Copper cauldrons may have been used for large-scale boiling in the wealthiest of kitchens, but for the most part, clay was the medium of Egyptian cooking. The tools, or utensils, used by the royal chefs were simple but effective. long-handled. Wooden spoons and spatulas were essential for stirring stews and porridges in deep, hot pots. A variety of bronze knives in different shapes and sizes were crucial for chopping vegetables and portioning meat. Sieves, made of woven reeds or horsehair stretched over a wooden frame, were used for sifting flour to achieve different grades of fineness, and for straining beer, wine, and sauces to remove impurities and create a smoother consistency. Stone, mortar, and pestles of various sizes were indispensable. Large ones were used for pounding grain or dried legumes, while smaller ones were used for grinding spices, crushing herbs, and preparing medicinal compounds. Tongs, likely made of wood or bronze, would have been used to safely handle hot coals and to move or turn food cooking directly on the fire. It is important to note the absence of forks. The Egyptians ate with their hands, specifically their right hand, using pieces of flatbread to scoop up sauces and stews. The staff of the royal kitchen was a large and rigidly hierarchical organization, led by a high-ranking official, perhaps titled the overseer of the kitchen or chief of cooks. This was a position of immense trust and responsibility, as this person was ultimately responsible for the pharaoh's health, safety, and satisfaction. Mistake could be fatal, both for the pharaoh and the cook. Under this overseer was a legion of specialists. There were the sasu, butchers, the retinue, bakers, and the afetu, brewers. The cooks who prepared the final dishes were also specialized. Some might be expert roasters, shifatu, responsible for tending the spits of meat over the fire. Others might specialize in sauces, pastries, or the preparation of vegetables. The sheer scale of the operation demanded this division of labor. A single royal banquet could require feeding hundreds, if not thousands, of people. The culinary techniques employed by these chefs were varied and well-honed. Roasting was clearly a favorite method for preparing high-quality meat, turning it brown and savory over an open flame. Boiling was also extremely common, the basis for countless soups, stews, and porridges. A large ceramic pot would be filled with water, meat, and vegetables like onions, leeks, and garlic, and then left to simmer over the hearth for hours, tenderizing the meat and melding the flavors into a nutritious one-pot meal. Frying was also practiced. Small cakes or pieces of meat could be fried in shallow pottery dishes with rendered animal fat or vegetable oil, such as sesame oil, moringa oil, or, for the truly wealthy, imported olive oil. A more gentle cooking method, akin to steaming, could be achieved by wrapping food, such as fish, in large leaves like lotus leaves, and placing the package in the hot embers. This would protect the food from burning and keep it wonderfully moist. The seasonings available to the palace chefs were what truly elevated their cuisine. Salt was universal. Garlic and onions were the foundational flavorings, but a wide range of herbs and spices were also available. Coriander, cumin, fenugreek, dill, and mustard seeds were all grown in Egypt and used to add warmth and complexity. The palace would have maintained its own herb garden to ensure a fresh supply. And for the pharaoh's personal dishes, there were the ultra-luxury imported spices, cinnamon from Asia and black pepper from India, which began to appear in the new kingdom. These were unimaginably expensive, and a single peppercorn was worth a fortune. Their use was the ultimate culinary status symbol. a final flourish of flavor that was truly fit for a king. A banquet in the palace of the Pharaoh was far more than a simple meal, however lavish. It was a meticulously orchestrated piece of political and religious theater, a multi-sensory spectacle designed to awe and impress. It was an occasion for the conspicuous display of wealth, the reinforcement of the rigid social hierarchy, and the public celebration of the pharaoh's divine status and his role as the great provider. From the elaborate preparations and decorations of the hall to the specific etiquette observed by the guests, every single aspect of a royal feast was imbued with deep and complex meaning. These were not casual affairs, but grand ceremonies that affirmed the very structure of the Egyptian state and its proper place within the cosmic order of Mat. The setting for a major banquet would have been one of the grand halls within the palace complex, richly and transformed for the occasion. The columned halls, already impressive in their scale, would be further embellished. The walls might be hung with fine, brilliantly colored linen tapestries depicting scenes of victory, hunts, or religious festivals. The floors would be covered with fresh reed mats, and perhaps even luxurious imported carpets from the Near East. The primary source of light would be the warm, flickering glow of dozens, if not hundreds, of oil lamps. These lamps ranged from simple pottery bowls to ornate, multi-nozzled creations carved from translucent alabaster, which would cast a soft, ethereal light throughout the space. The wicks burned not in simple oil, but in oil infused with perfumes, filling the air with the exotic fragrances of myrrh, frankincense, and lotus blossoms. The central focus of the entire hall was the pharaoh himself. He would be seated on a raised throne, often made of gilded wood and inlaid with ivory and semi-precious stones. The throne itself rested on a dais, a platform that elevated him physically. Above all his guests, a clear and unambiguous representation of his supreme status. He might be joined by his chief wife, the great royal wife, and other close members of the royal family, creating an unapproachable tableau of power. The guests were a carefully selected assembly of the kingdom's elite, a who's who of ancient Egypt. High-ranking government officials like the vizier and the treasurer, provincial governors, nomarchs, top military commanders, the high priests of the most powerful cults like that of Amun-Ra, and visiting foreign dignitaries or tributary princes would all vie for a coveted invitation. Their placement within the hall was a matter of intense political significance and a source of great anxiety. The closer a guest was seated to the pharaoh's dais, the higher their status and the greater the favor they currently enjoyed. To be seated near the king was a public honor. To be placed at a distance near the entrance was a subtle but clear sign of diminished influence. The seating arrangement was a living, breathing map of power and intrigue at the royal court. Guests would arrive at the palace dressed in their absolute finest attire, a display of their own personal wealth and status. For the elite, this meant garments of the highest quality white linen, so finely woven as to be almost transparent. Men wore kilts, while women wore long, elegant sheath dresses. Over these they would adorn themselves with elaborate and heavy jewelry. The most prominent piece was the wesek, or broad collar necklace, composed of multiple rows of colorful beads made from faience, a glazed ceramic, carnelian, lapis lazuli, turquoise, and gold. They wore heavy bracelets on their wrists and arms, anklets, and intricate earrings. Both men and women of high status also wore elaborate wigs, made from either human hair or plant fibers, intricately braided, curled, and often decorated with golden rings or beads. Upon arrival, a unique and curious element of Egyptian formal wear was added: the scented cone. These were cones made of solid animal fat or beeswax that had been infused with fragrant perfumes like myrrh. The cone was placed on top of the guest's wig. Over the course of the long, warm evening, the heat from the guest's body would slowly melt the cone, causing the perfumed fat to trickle down over the wig and clothes, acting as a personal mobile air freshener and a very conspicuous symbol of luxury. As the guests found their places, servants would move gracefully and silently among them. They offered bowls of water, often scented with flowers, and a small towel for the ritual washing of hands. They would then drape fresh floral garlands made of lotus blossoms, cornflowers, and mandrake fruits around each guest's neck. The air would be thick with a heady mix of perfumes, flowers, and incense. Music was an essential component of the atmosphere, weaving through the conversations and setting the mood. Musicians, often depicted as young, beautiful women dressed in diaphanous garments, would play a variety of instruments: the gentle, rippling notes of the harp, the strumming of lutes and lyres, the breathy sound of single and double reed flutes, and the rhythmic beat of hand drums and clappers created a constant, sophisticated soundscape. Dancers, both male and female, would perform their graceful, sometimes acrobatic movements, adding to the festive and sensuous ambiance of the evening. The food itself was served in a seemingly endless succession of courses, a testament to the abundance of the royal kitchens and the fertility of the land. Unlike modern formal dining, the guests did not sit at one large communal table. Instead, they sat on comfortable cushions or low stools at small individual tables, upon which the food was placed by the servants. The feast was a visual spectacle. Servants would bring out platter after platter, laden with an incredible variety of dishes. There would be whole roasted geese and ducks with crispy skin, large joints of beef glistening with fat, grilled fish from the Nile seasoned with herbs, and perhaps exotic game like gazelle. These main courses would be accompanied by a vast array of breads in different shapes and flavors, and numerous bowls of stewed vegetables, lentils, salads of fresh greens, and, of course, the ever-present onions and garlic. The sheer quantity and variety were meant to overwhelm the senses and serve as a powerful demonstration of the Pharaoh's wealth and his ability to provide for his loyal followers. Etiquette required a certain decorum, though the atmosphere was festive. Guests ate with their right hands, as the left was considered unclean. They would use pieces of flatbread to scoop up food and sauces. Bones and other scraps were discreetly dropped onto the floor or onto empty platters to be cleared away by the ever-watchful servants. The consumption of wine was copious and encouraged. Servants, often depicted as young, lithe girls, constantly circulated with wine jars, refilling the guests' cups. These cups were simple bowls or more elegant goblets made of pottery, blue-green faience, or for the very highest elite, precious metals like silver or gold. While the wine flowed freely and guests were encouraged to enjoy themselves to the fullest, The Egyptians were also aware of the less glamorous side of overindulgence. Sun-tuned scenes and a touch of humorous realism include a morning after vignette showing guests vomiting or being carried away, perhaps as a gentle moral reminder of the dangers of excess. Crucially, the banquet was deeply connected to religious ritual. Food and drink were not just for the living guests. They were also for the gods and the spirits of departed ancestors. A portion of the finest food and drink would be ritually offered at a small shrine or altar to the gods before the feast began, ensuring their favor and benevolent participation. The banquet itself could be seen as a living celebration of Mat, the core Egyptian concept of cosmic order, harmony, truth, and justice. The overflowing abundance of the feast was tangible proof that Mat was being upheld by the Pharaoh, that the land was prosperous, and that the gods were pleased with his rule. It was a powerful reaffirmation of the divine compact that underpinned the entire civilization. By feasting with the Pharaoh, the elite were participating in this cosmic balance, celebrating their own good fortune as a direct result of the king's righteous reign. For the ancient Egyptians, life on earth was but a fleeting prelude, a temporary and challenging phase before the true, eternal, and unchanging existence in the afterlife. Their entire culture, their complex religion, their art, and their awe-inspiring, monumental architecture were profoundly shaped by this core belief. Central to their elaborate preparations for this next world was the unwavering conviction that the deceased, and especially the divine Pharaoh, would need all the same comforts, tools, and sustenance they had enjoyed in life. Chief among these essential needs was food. The concept of the funerary offering was not merely symbolic or sentimental. It was a deeply practical and absolutely essential provision to ensure the eternal well-being, nourishment, and survival of the soul. The tomb was not a grave in our sense of the word. It was an eternal house, a castle of eternity, and its larder had to be perpetually and magically stocked. The most basic and ubiquitous form of this provision was the het di nesiu, which translates to an offering which the king gives. This was the official name for the standard offering formula, a powerful prayer that was inscribed on virtually every funerary object, from the grand walls of a tomb to stele, coffins, and even small statues. This prayer was more than just a request. It was a potent magical spell, a ritual utterance that was believed to have the power to create reality. The formula typically called upon the king to make an offering to a god associated with the dead, usually Osiris, the lord of the underworld, or Anubis, the god of embalming. The god, having received his due, would in turn provide for the ka, or life force of the deceased individual named in the text. The prayer would then list the desired provisions, famously asking for 1,000 of bread, 1,000 of beer, 1,000 of oxen, 1,000 of fowl, 1,000 of alabaster vessels, and 1,000 of linen, along with every good and pure thing on which a god lives. The number 1,000 was not meant to be taken literally, but was the Egyptian way of signifying an infinite, inexhaustible supply. The Egyptians believed that the oral recitation of this formula by visitors to the tomb, or even its mere presence in written hieroglyphs, had the power to magically manifest these provisions for the soul in the afterlife, sustaining it for all eternity. But the Egyptians were a famously practical people. and did not rely on magic alone. They backed up their spells with physical goods. The burial chambers of the elite, and especially of the pharaohs, were filled with an astonishing quantity and variety of actual food offerings. These were meant to serve as the first meals for the deceased upon their reawakening in the next world. Archaeologists have found plates of cooked meat, trussed and roasted ducks, whole fish, loaves of bread in dozens of different shapes, bowls of fresh fruit, and large jars of wine and beer, all sealed and left in the tomb on the day of burial. The incredibly well-preserved tomb of Tutankhamun provides the most famous example. It contained over 100 woven baskets filled with fruit, including dates, figs, grapes, and pomegranates. It also held 48 wooden boxes containing joints of beef and cuts of poultry, carefully selected, cooked, and packed for the young king's eternal feast. Dozens of wine jars, meticulously labeled with their vintage and origin, stood ready for him to drink. This was not just a token gesture. It was a full pantry for a king. These physical offerings were, of course, finite. The bread would grow stale, the meat would decay. To solve the problem of providing sustenance for millions of years, the Egyptians developed two ingenious and beautiful solutions: artistic representations and models. The walls of the chapels and chambers of their tombs were covered in vibrant, detailed paintings and carved reliefs depicting every imaginable aspect of food production and consumption. These were not mere decorations to brighten up the afterlife. For the Egyptians, the image held the same reality as the object it depicted. They believed that these images had the power to become real for the Ka-soul in the afterlife. Thus, the scenes of farmers harvesting grain, women grinding flour, bakers tending their ovens, butchers slaughtering oxen, and vintners pressing grapes were not just memories of life, but a magical, self-sustaining engine that would perpetually generate these items for the tomb owner. The quintessential scene of the deceased seated before a table piled impossibly high with food was a magical guarantee that he or she would never go hungry. By painting a feast, they made the feast eternal. In addition to the two-dimensional paintings, the tombs of the Old and Middle Kingdoms in particular were often equipped with three-dimensional models. These were small, intricate, and lively dioramas, made of painted wood, depicting entire scenes of daily life with a charming realism. There were models of granaries with tiny figures carrying sacks of grain up the stairs. There were bakeries with figures kneading dough and tending the ovens. There were breweries, butcher shops with miniature oxen being slaughtered, and boats with fishermen casting their nets. These models were believed to function as magical substitutes for the real thing. In the afterlife, the tiny painted figures would come to life and work for the deceased, ensuring that their farm, their kitchen, and their brewery would continue to operate for all time, providing an endless supply of fresh bread, beer, and meat without the tomb owner having to lift a finger. The food provided for the dead was also carefully selected for its deep symbolic and religious meaning. Certain foods were believed to possess regenerative properties that would aid in the deceased's difficult rebirth into the next world. Bread and beer, the staples of life, were essential for sustaining the soul. Beef, particularly the powerful foreleg or kepesh, symbolized strength and power. Geese were associated with the god Amun and the great cackler, the goose whose egg hatched to create the world. Figs from the sacred sycamore tree provided a direct link to the goddess Nut, who would nourish the soul. Wine was symbolically linked to the blood of Osiris and his resurrection. The menu for the afterlife was therefore not just a list of the deceased's favorite foods, but a carefully curated selection of ritually potent substances, each chosen to magically transform and empower the dead, ensuring their successful transition to a state of eternal blessedness as an Akh or transfigured spirit. This entire system of eternal provision was powered by the institution of the funerary cult. For a pharaoh, this was a massive, state-sponsored enterprise. A dedicated mortuary temple was constructed near his tomb, staffed by a college of endowed priests and servants. Their primary job was to perform the daily rituals and present real food offerings at the temple's altar, which was dedicated to the cult of the deceased king. These offerings would be laid out, the proper prayers recited, and after the ka of the deceased pharaoh had magically consumed the spiritual essence of the food, the physical items were reverted. This reverted offering was then divided among the priests and temple staff as their salary. This clever and self-sustaining system created a powerful economic incentive for the priests to maintain the cult and continue the offerings, theoretically, ensuring that the pharaoh would be fed for as long as his temple stood and his memory was honored. The food of the afterlife was, in the end, the most profound expression of the importance of cuisine in ancient Egypt. It demonstrates that for them, food was far more than simple fuel. It was life, status, pleasure, and power. It was the very substance that connected the human to the divine, the living to the dead, and the temporary to the eternal. Our culinary journey through the land of the pharaohs has reached its end. We have traveled from the fertile black fields of the Nile Valley to the opulent, perfumed banquet halls of the royal palace, and finally into the silent, eternal darkness of the tomb. We have seen that the story of food in ancient Egypt is the story of the civilization itself, a narrative of divine providence, human ingenuity, social hierarchy, and an unshakable belief in an afterlife that was just as hungry as the life that preceded it. We began where all Egyptian life began, with the river. We saw how the predictable rhythm of the Nile's inundation, its gift of black silt, and the three distinct seasons of Akhet, Pare, and Shamu dictated not just the agricultural calendar, but the very structure of society. This fertile land gave rise to the foundational pillars of the Egyptian diet, emmer wheat and barley. From these humble grains, we witnessed the birth of a culinary revolution, the invention of leavened bread, and the perfection of the brewing process, which created the nutritious beer that served as both food and currency for an entire kingdom. We explored the everyday bounty of the land, the onions, garlic, and legumes that formed the flavorful base of the common meal, and the precious oils that brought them to life. From this foundation, we ascended to the highest echelons of society, to the pharaoh's table. Here, the menu was not about sustenance, but about status and power. We saw the vast herds of prized cattle, force-fed to produce the most tender meat, and the ritual significance of the hunt, a symbolic display of the king's mastery over chaos. We explored the teeming poultry yards and the ingenious methods used to trap the wild birds of the marshes, and we navigated the complex social and religious taboos surrounding the consumption of fish. We tasted nature's sweetness in the form of luscious dates, sacred figs, and the ultimate luxury honey, harvested by the world's first beekeepers. And we raised a cup of the finest Delta wine, a beverage of connoisseurs whose vintage and origin were as carefully recorded as any royal. Decree. We stepped into the bustling world of the royal kitchen, a highly organized culinary factory staffed by a hierarchy of specialists. We saw their simple but effective tools, their sophisticated techniques of roasting, stewing, and seasoning, and their ability to transform the raw bounty of Egypt into a feast fit for a god. This feast was then served at the grand banquet, a spectacle of sensory overload. The music, the dancers, the scented cones, and the sheer, overwhelming abundance of food were all part of a carefully constructed piece of political theater, designed to showcase the pharaoh's wealth and his role as the divine upholder of Mat, the cosmic order. Finally, we followed this obsession with food into the tomb to see how the Egyptians provisioned a meal for eternity. Through the magic of the offering formula, the reality of physical food offerings, and the eternal potential of painted reliefs and wooden models, they sought to ensure that the Ka soul would never go hungry. The funerary meal was the ultimate expression of their belief system, a testament to their conviction that a good life, filled with good food and drink, was a pleasure so profound that it was worth preserving for all time. The story of what the Egyptians ate is a powerful reminder that food is never just food. It is a reflection of the land, a symbol of community, a marker of status, an instrument of power, and an expression of our deepest beliefs about life and death. The flavors of ancient Egypt may have faded into the dust of millennia, but the rich and complex story they tell remains as nourishing and fascinating as the feasts they once graced. Thank you for joining me on this journey. May your own table be a place of abundance, community, and good stories.